If Pints with Aquinas has helped you and you'd like to support the show, well, you can now do that. Go to pintswithaquinas.com and click the big Patreon banner up the top. By supporting the show, even for as little as $2 a month, which, what's that, amounts to 50 cents an episode, you'll get some neat thank you gifts. Gifts include things like a free Pints with Aquinas sticker posted to your front door, access to an ever-growing library of exclusive, in-depth interviews between me and philosophers, converts, and apologists, a new ebook that I've written on Aquinas' metaphysical jargon, and another one of the gifts is perhaps me interviewing you for Pints with Aquinas. Look, there's other gifts as well. I won't go into them all here. And the thing is, I know that people don't support the show just to get a sticker or an ebook or more audio content. People support the show because they actually appreciate it. And I appreciate you appreciating it. I don't want this show just to continue. I want it to go from good to great. And I'm honored by your support. Again, go to pintswithaquinas.com and click the Patreon banner to learn more. Welcome to Pints with Aquinas, episode 40. I'm Matt Fradd. If you could sit down with St. Thomas Aquinas over a pint of beer and ask him any one question, what would it be? Today, we'll ask St. Thomas this question. Was it necessary for our salvation that the second person of the Blessed Trinity should become incarnate? Thanks for joining us once again here at Pints with Aquinas. This is the show where you and I pull up a bar stool next to the angelic doctor and discuss theology and philosophy. Well, we have officially ended the season of Christmas, and I hope you had a great one. And I thought it might be helpful if we discuss the incarnation of Jesus Christ. So I want to do two things in this podcast. I want to ask that question, which I mentioned in the intro. Was it necessary that Christ should become, incarnate, necessary for our salvation? And then I would like to talk about a popular objection to Christianity these days, which has to do with the incarnation of Christ, just being a spin-off of ancient, perhaps pagan gods like Horus and that sort of thing. So those are the two things we want to do. So let's do them in order. The first thing we'll do is look at what Aquinas has to say. And this comes from the third part of the Summa Theologiae, question 1, article 2. And I'll be sure to put this answer in the description of this podcast. So if you're sitting down, you might decide to read along. If not, you can go back later and read it. Now, I love St. Thomas Aquinas. This dude is the bomb. And one of the reasons I love him is how simply he explains things. He explains things, with bullet points. And today we certainly see that. I'll get into what he says, but just real quickly, one of the things that he does, two of the things that he does in this answer is he gives us 5 reasons, 5 reasons the incarnation was useful for the furtherance in good. And after he gives us those 5 reasons, he then gives us 5 reasons it was useful for withdrawing us from evil. So it's all very easy to follow. But let's see what he has to say. Was the incarnation of Jesus Christ necessary for our salvation? Well, before we hear what Thomas has to say, what do you think? Don't be embarrassed. No one else will know if you get the wrong answer. It's not like one of those things where people say, raise your hand if you think this, and then you feel like an idiot. When they're like, you're wrong. You're a heretic. Don't worry, you wouldn't be a heretic either way. But what do you say? Was it necessary or not? And why do you think that? I think it's really important that we don't just sort of passively engage with Aquinas, but we try to think through our answers. Will we say yes, it was necessary? Will we say no, and why not? Well, here's what Aquinas says. He says, quote, "A thing is said to be necessary for a certain end in 2 ways. First, when the end cannot be without it, as food is necessary for the preservation of human life. Secondly, when the end is attained better and more conveniently, as a horse is necessary for a journey. In the first way, are you ready? He's going to give you the answer here. Are you listening? In the first way, it was not necessary that God should become incarnate for the restoration of human nature. Interesting, huh? So those two ways of things a thing can be necessary. All right. First, when the end cannot be without it. Okay. So if the end is the preservation of human life, okay, well, yeah, it's strictly necessary that I take in food. And there's that second way when we say that the end is attained more conveniently. So it's necessary to catch a plane to go to Australia if you want to visit there. But of course, there are other ways to visit. I could take a boat, a ship. And Aquinas says it's not necessary that Christ should become man in that first sense in which we use the word necessary. That kind of, I think, surprises a lot of people. Well, why? Well, he says this, for God, with his omnipotent power, could have restored human nature in many other ways. Okay, but it is necessary, he says, in the second way. In the second way, it was necessary that God should become incarnate for the restoration of human nature. Hence, Aquinas says, Augustine says, we shall also show that other ways were not wanting to God, to whose power all things are equally subject, but that there was not a more fitting way of healing our misery. Okay? Incidentally, I did an episode, I don't have it in front of me, so I can't even tell you the number, but the question was the crucifixion of Christ necessary for our salvation? Something to that effect. Go listen to that one, because of course the answer is going to be the same. And I speak a lot about how if we can say the cross was necessary for our salvation in that second sense, we can say the same thing, and perhaps more so, about the Blessed Mother. Not to freak anyone out, but yes, the Blessed Mother was necessary for our salvation in that sense too. I make the case that, an inanimate object cannot choose the will of God, but Mary had the choice. She could have chosen or not chosen to respond to God's invitation, and she did. Anyway, here are 5 reasons Aquinas gives that the Incarnation was useful for the furtherance in good. He says, first, with regard to faith, which is made more certain by believing God himself who speaks. Hence, Augustine says, in order that man might journey more trustfully towards the truth itself, the Son of God, having assumed human nature, established and founded faith. That's a good point, right? If a prophet says something, I might believe him, especially if he can display certain acts which show me that he's a prophet. But if the Son of God should tell me something, then my faith is made more certain. Secondly, he says, with regard to hope, which is thereby greatly strengthened. Hence, Augustine says, nothing was so necessary for raising our hopes as to show us how deeply God loved us. And what could afford us a stronger proof of this than that the Son of God should become a partner with us of human nature? Thirdly, with regard to charity, which is greatly enkindled by this. Hence, Augustine says, what greater cause is there of the Lord's coming than to show God's love for us? And he afterwards adds, if we have been slow to love, at least let us hasten to love in return. Fourthly, the Incarnation was useful with regard to well-doing, in which he, Christ, sets us an example. Hence, Augustine says in a sermon, man who might be seen was not to be followed, but God was to be followed who could not be seen, And therefore, God was made man, that he who might be seen by man and whom man might follow might be shown to man. And fifthly, the Incarnation, Aquinas says, was useful with regard to the full participation of the divinity, which is the true bliss of man and the end of human life. And this is bestowed upon us by Christ's humanity. For Augustine says in a sermon, God was made man, that man might be made God. And of course, made God, we might say with a lowercase g, that we get to participate in the divinity of God. That's what we'll be doing in heaven. Can we just stop for a second and point out how often Aquinas quotes Augustine? We just went through 5 reasons the Incarnation was useful for the furtherance in good, and each of those points you'll notice Aquinas quotes Augustine. In the next 5 points he gives us for why the Incarnation was useful for withdrawing us from evil, he's going to quote Augustine again. So we often say that Aquinas baptized Aristotle, which he did. However, he quotes Augustine far more than he quotes Aristotle. And I think one of the reasons for this, apart from the fact that he agreed with Augustine, is that Augustine was the authority of the day. So whereas today, perhaps in Catholic theological discussions, in order to make a point, we might appeal to Aquinas, right, for backup, I think Aquinas was doing the same thing, especially since there was a lot of controversy around the writings of Aristotle at the time. By appealing to, the main authority in Catholic theology, you get to, have backup, as it were. Okay, let's look at these 5 reasons Aquinas now gives us for why the Incarnation was useful to withdraw us from evil. Okay, first, because man is taught by it not to prefer the devil to himself, nor to honor him who is the author of sin. Hence, Augustine says, since human nature is so united to God as to become one person, let not these proud spirits dare to prefer themselves to man, because they have no bodies. Secondly, because we are thereby taught how great is man's dignity, lest we should sully it with sin. Hence, Augustine says, God has proved to us how high a place human nature holds amongst creatures, inasmuch as he appeared to men as a true man. And Pope Leo says in a sermon on the Nativity, learn, O Christian, thy worth, and being made a partner of the divine nature, refuse to return by evil deeds to your former worthlessness. Thirdly, because in order to do away with man's presumption, the grace of God is commended in Jesus Christ through no merits of ours. Sorry, let me say that again. Though no merits of ours went before, as Augustine says in De Trinitate. Fourthly, because man's pride, which is the greatest stumbling block to our clinging to God, can be convinced and cured by humility so great, as Augustine says in the same place. Fifthly, in order to free man from the thraldom of sin. If you've never heard the word thraldom before, it just means subjugation, right? So the subjugation of sin, which, as Augustine says, quote, ought to be done in such a way that the devil should be overcome by the justice of the man Jesus Christ, end quote. And this was done by Christ satisfying for us. Now, a mere man could not have satisfied for the whole human race, and God was not bound to satisfy. Hence, it behooved Jesus Christ to be both God and man. Hence, Pope Leo says in the same sermon, quote, weakness is assumed by strength, lowliness by majesty, mortality by eternity, in order that one and the same mediator of God and men might die in one and rise in the other. For this was our fitting remedy. Unless he was God, he would not have brought a remedy. And unless he was man, he would not have set an example. And there are very many other advantages which go beyond man's apprehension. All right, there is the main bulk of the answer. This is why it wasn't strictly necessary that Christ should become man for the salvation of the human race, since God in his omnipotence could have forgiven us in all sorts of ways. But that secondly, it was certainly necessary in the second sense, most conveniently, better attained. Okay, well, if you're still with me, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll discuss this whole idea that Jesus is just a spin-off of pagan myths.
My name is Gomer, and I'm the co-host of Catching Foxes. Catching Foxes. I would like to tell you about something more important than my podcast.
What?
Pints with Aquinas. Pints with Aquinas. Matt Fradd actually wrote a book on 50-plus deep thoughts from the angelic doctor. Pints with Aquinas. Here's the deal. Beer is easily lovable, but medieval monastic philosophers, they can be quite intimidating. Yet in this short, pithy book, and I don't use that word often. In fact, I never use the word pithy, but I'm going to use it here, and you're going to agree with me. Matt Fradd made the greatest mind in the history of the church as easily accessible as your favorite beer. You'll laugh. You'll cry. Well, you won't cry, but you'll laugh, and you'll discover that this old school philosopher's wisdom is just as relevant today as it was back then. So do yourself a favor. Get a copy of this enlightening, pithy little book from Amazon right now. And when it arrives, pour yourself a frothy pint and dig in. You'll be glad you did.
All right, welcome back. Good to have you back with us. I hope you're ready for another round, because I think that this part, even though Aquinas doesn't address this issue, I think it's really helpful, especially in this day and age where we have many, new atheists who want to say certain things, and this is one of them. Basically, the claim is that many different religions tell myth stories, some about gods being incarnate, right? And even dying and rising gods. And therefore, the idea is that Jesus is just a spin-off of these pagan myths. Now, before we look at some of these alleged parallels between Christianity and paganism and why they're false, it's important to note this fact. This is the first thing I think we should say when dialoguing with someone who says, look at these similarities, therefore Jesus is a spin-off. We have to point out that similarity does not imply dependence. Similarity does not imply dependence. What do I mean? Well, even if Christianity did have beliefs and practices similar to those of earlier religions, it wouldn't follow from that there must be a causal connection between them. In a sense, and I think C.S. Lewis talked about this somewhere, we should expect similarities between religions. These things shouldn't surprise us. Why? Well, most religions are trying to answer the same fundamental questions in life, right? Questions like questions of origin, where do we come from? Questions about the future, is there an afterlife? Questions about how we should live. And most religions have rituals and sacred stories and these sorts of things, moral codes. So I think the first thing we should point out is it would be surprising if there weren't some similarities among them. In fact, you might say that the similarities are actually a sign that God does exist. You might expect different religions in different eras and cultures to reach many similar conclusions. And this is one of the things I think that I came to an understanding of after my conversion to Christ in the year 2000. This idea that virtually every civilization in the history of mankind has believed in God or something like God. And far from that being an argument against the existence of God, maybe it's a proof that something like God exists, namely God. All right, but what about specifically these claims that Christian beliefs about Jesus are adapted from pagan cults? They're definitely popular today, but they're nothing new. a school of 19th century German theologians were basically seeking to interpret Jesus, and this shouldn't surprise us, I don't think, against a pagan background rather than a Jewish one. All right, probably, or I shouldn't say probably, but perhaps for anti-Semitic desires, right? Wanting an Aryan Jesus instead of a Jewish one. Now, this movement continued into the early 20th century, with writers who sought to deny basically just the historicity of Christ, and they were drawing upon the work of liberal German theologians. But here's the thing, mainstream scholarship didn't take these critics seriously, and that's why you probably haven't heard about them today. Their work fell into relative obscurity. It wasn't until the 1970s when a British professor, his name Wells, translated these works into English. And when he did that, this whole idea of mythicism began to rise to prominence again. However prominent it might seem to us, maybe we've seen the Zeitgeist movie and that sort of thing, or we've heard others talk about it a lot, it's still relatively a fringe movement. And what's interesting is even Wells abandoned it, admitting that there is a historical basis for the stories of Jesus. And then this is something that even agnostics such as, Bart Ehrman, right, who's become popular for his arguments against the reliability of the New Testament, people like him admit that Jesus obviously was a real historical figure. Here's a quote from him. He says, "The view that Jesus existed is held by virtually every expert on the planet. But certainly the popular impact of mythicism continues, and we should probably address it somewhat. So, let's do that. Among the most ancient pagan deities of which people say that Christ is a copy of, the Egyptian god Horus seems to get the most attention. And we could say a heck of a lot about the alleged parallels between Jesus and Horus, but since we're kind of, this is a shortish kind of podcast, and you probably don't have the attention span to listen to all of it, and I might not have the attention span to say it all, let's limit the alleged parallels to three things, okay? Number one, we'll talk about Horus's quote-unquote virgin birth. Number two, some talk about his crucifixion. And three, his resurrection. So let's go through those one at a time. First of all, this idea that Horus was born of a virgin mother. Not true. First of all, several different and contradictory stories about Horus have developed gradually over the last 3,000 years. But the most common one, the most common story of his conception, that mythicists often talk about today, involves his father, whose name was Osiris, and his mother, Isis. And it goes like this. Basically, Osiris, this gets really weird, and if you've got little kids listening, you probably should listen to this later, okay? There's my warning. Osiris, Horus's dad, was murdered, and his body was cut up into, I think it was 14 different pieces, and spread all over Egypt. Then his mother, Isis, went around collecting them. Now, are you ready for this? This gets kind of funny. She was able to find 13 pieces of her husband's body. What was the one piece she couldn't find? His penis. Why? Because it was eaten by catfish at the bottom of the Nile. You heard that correctly. I knew catfish were disgusting. Okay, so what happens next? Isis, forgive me. Again, if you've got children, you might want to turn this down. Isis, Horus's mother, creates a wooden dildo and impregnates herself with this dildo. Sorry, that's how it went down. Now, the idea that this was a virgin birth hardly seems, it's not at all a virgin birth. Okay. What about the second idea that Horus was crucified? Well, first of all, how did he die? Well, just like we talked about earlier with his birth, it depends on which account you go by. There's at least 3 ways that I've read that Horus died. 1 says he didn't die at all. 2, he died as a child after having been stung by a scorpion. And 3, the third way people say he died is that his death is usually conflated with Osiris's, which I mentioned above, right? Being cut up and spread over Egypt. Now, have you guys seen the popular mythicist film Zeitgeist? When you watch it, it seems incredibly convincing. You've got that guy reading in the very dry academic style, and you're like, oh my goodness. But guys, if you just go through this step by step, you see how ridiculous it is. And here's one of the ways in which it's ridiculous. This video claims that that Horus was crucified. Now, that's interesting, since crucifixion was a Roman invention. There was no Egyptian equivalent. That's the first thing to point out. So why would they say it? Why would they say that Horus was crucified? Are you ready for this? They say that because there are images of Horus standing with outstretched arms. That's it. And you might be thinking, come on, that's not why they say it. Yeah, it is actually. When you read their film's study guide, which I had to read, unfortunately, for this podcast, it explains this. It says, quote, "The issue at hand is not of a man being thrown to the ground and nailed to a cross as Jesus is depicted to have been, but the betrayal of gods and goddesses in cruciform, whereby the divine figure appears with arms outstretched in a symbolic context." Okay, well, that's really friggin' different, actually. If you're going to say that Horus was crucified and by that you mean he was standing with his arms outstretched, I mean, like, come on, not really the same thing. By this line of reasoning, we could also conclude that, I don't know, Barney the dinosaur was also crucified, since I've seen many images of him standing with his arms outstretched. Okay, thirdly and finally, the idea that Horus rose from the dead. Now, though there are many uniform claims flying around that Jesus' resurrection is borrowed from Horus, the fact is, okay, that dying and the revivification of Horus is vastly dissimilar to the death and resurrection of Christ. And the general view that ancient pagan religions were filled with dying and rising gods, sometimes you hear people say this, and this that they would then kind of argue that the New Testament authors borrowed this idea in order to concoct the story of Christ. It just doesn't pass scholarly muster. I'm sorry, it doesn't. Here's a quote from the Encyclopedia of Religion. Here it is. It says, "The category of dying and rising gods, once a major topic of scholarly investigation, must be understood to have been largely a misnomer based on imaginative reconstructions. There is no unambiguous instance in the history of religions of a dying and rising deity." End quote. So, as we wrap up this podcast today, I want to just suggest 3 things to keep in mind, okay? 1. Okay, so these are 3 things. Like if you're encountering someone, they tell you that Jesus is a spin-off. All right, here are three things you should do. Number 1, ask them, where are you getting your information? You know, is it from a website? Is it from a YouTube video? And if it is, well, that's fine, but where is this website or YouTube video getting its information from? And I think what you'll find is most people won't know. So that's kind of nice. You be the one asking the question and have them admit, well, I don't know, just different places. Where? Well, figure it out and get back to me. The second thing you should do is take the parallels one at a time. Now, we just looked at 3, right? The birth of Christ, the death of Christ, the resurrection of Christ. And you see as you go through them one by one that they're really not similar at all. But I think what often happens when we're dealing with mythicists is they rattle off a list of alleged parallels, and it appears as they're doing that that the evidence is overwhelming, and that it is often how it feels. It's sometimes been called shotgun apologetics, where you just throw a whole bunch of stuff out there that no one can possibly process and respond to in one conversation. But as I say, if you take the time to examine each apparent supposed parallel, you'll find, as we found, that they're really not similar at all. Third thing I'd say is study the parallels from authoritative sources for yourself, and don't take unscholarly claims as at face value. Let me just grab this book off the shelf. Sorry about that. I have a book here which you might be interested if you want to learn more. Talking of scholarly sources, I had to read some of this when I was writing my little book on atheism. It's called the Oxford Essential Guide to Egyptian Mythology. All right, put out by Penguin. This is great for podcast, isn't it? No, put out by Berkeley Books. So you might check that out. Edited by Donald B. Redford. All right, my brothers and my sisters, I hope that was a helpful podcast. Couple of things I want to do. Number one, I want to thank everybody, and there's not a terrible amount of you, but there are some, and I'm so thankful for you, those who have supported this show on Patreon. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I hope you're enjoying the thank you gifts that I've been giving back to you. If you're open, even slightly open to the possibility of supporting this podcast, even for $2 a month, go to patreon.com/PWA, Pints with Aquinas. I'll put a link in the description of this podcast. And just think about it. Have a look. I'd greatly appreciate it. If you're listening right now and you haven't rated Pints with Aquinas on iTunes, is it okay if I ask you to do that? You're thinking, no, it's not okay. Well, I just did, so there you go, deal with it. But anyway, if you could rate the show, I'd greatly appreciate it. That helps other people to see the podcast when they type things in like Horus or penis at the bottom of the Nile. Not sure who would type that in. All right, guys, God bless you. Look forward to speaking to you next week. Oh, by the way, do you want to know what next week is about? You're going to love it. You're going to love it. You're going to love it. I interview Dr. Randall Rouser. He's a theologian up in Canada, and I throw 5 objections to the existence of God at him, and he knocks each of them out of the park. So you're going to love it. All right. God bless. Talk to you next week.